Well, good morning, Red Gum. Welcome to my bird aviary. Welcome, Simon from Ghana. Welcome to everyone online this morning with us. I've been in, I think, day 10 of isolation. I've been to a hospital in Sydney, and so I've been living in a camper van on our farm here, isolated from family. And you know what? Isolation does stuff to you. It messes with you. And I started having these, I don't know, I had this strange thought the other day, and this is it. I want to share it with you. This is the thought. I imagined inviting every one of you to my funeral. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not in a rush. I'm thinking like a quarter of a century away still, right? But I had this thought. I would love everyone I know to come and be at my funeral. And I'll tell you why. Because I believe you would feel inspired. Not by me, but by seeing a life lived that is lived for something bigger than just me. I wished when I came away from my mum's funeral, from my dad's funeral, I wish that everyone I knew could have been there. Like, to see a life that's lived for others, that's lived for something bigger than yourself, and see it condensed. And that's what happens in a funeral. It condenses a life. It's a little bit like the books of the Bible. Mark gives us 3.5 years of Jesus' life in 16 short chapters. And a funeral does that. And when I was at the end of Dad's funeral, someone that had been there at Mum's funeral, I came up to them and I thanked them for coming to Dad's funeral. And they said to me, "Oh, we wouldn't have missed it for anything. Like, Raymond funerals are always so inspiring." Now, that may be true, but I've been to funerals where, and you may have been as well, where you leave just empty. You feel like, if only. I wish you could have. I wish you would have known. And you feel it's saddened almost. So why is it that some funerals can be inspiring and other funerals just leave you empty? Well, it has to do with the life that people have lived. And I think what makes the difference is whether you have lived for something bigger than yourself. And people that live for something bigger than themselves, they do this, and I don't want you to miss this. They get bothered by things that other people ignore. They get bothered enough to do something about things that other people are just happy to leave as it is. I can live with mess. If you saw my office desk, it's usually a mess. Some of you would be bothered by that. You couldn't work in that environment. That's the principle I'm talking about, but I want to take the principle to a place where you live for something bigger than yourself, not just tidy workspace, but actually investing and sowing into the lives of others to build God's kingdom in other people. It's a very, very powerful thing. And it has generational consequences. Red Gum exists today because I'm sitting in Sydney and I get a phone call and I hear about some stuff that's happening in Bairnsdale. And we'd had this church we started 9 years earlier in Sydney, and I'd got to a place where I felt God had given us a freedom, a release to not continue there. And when I heard about something that was going on in Bairnsdale, I just knew that Bairnsdale didn't need another church, but it needed a church where people who have been hurt and damaged and disillusioned with church and have stopped being part of a church that had been hurt could come and be healed and find a safe place and be restored. But I knew that if that's all we did, it's too small a thing. I knew that Red Gum would be a church that would really reach into our community in ways that would, no strings attached, care for our community. And the fires gave us an opportunity to do that. In fact, we've had over $100,000 go through our hands in the fire recovery. We've reached into 120 families and cared for them in some practical way. We've had a team that's worked for months and months investing into other people, doing something bigger than themselves. Even 2 weeks ago, if there was a Sunday that we last gathered as a church and we prayed for people in a way that was different to what we've done before. And if you missed that, I'd really encourage you to go back and watch what happened that morning. But the stories that have come out of it already, like, I'm not overplaying it, but like miraculous, supernatural, life-changing things have happened because we prayed for people. We did something that was bigger than us. We prayed for another human being. We invested in you. We invested in others, and you helped us. We did this together. Now, 2,500 years ago, a guy called Nehemiah, he was a guy that lived for something bigger than himself. He was bothered by things that other people were happy to walk around, to just ignore. And it was the walls of Jerusalem. They had been broken down. They'd been broken down for a long, long time. And when Nehemiah heard about it, now, he wasn't born in Jerusalem. He was born in captivity. He was a first generation Israeli, Jewish, Babylonian, Persian. Like he was born in Babylon. And he just worked a 9-to-5 job. He wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a leader, but something he heard about bothered him. It bothered him so much that it showed externally, and he had a plan to do something. And in this just 9-to-5 job he had, he was working for an important person, the king of Persia, probably the most powerful human being on planet Earth at that time. And his job, Nehemiah's job, was to taste the wine before the king drank it. But he wasn't a waiter. His job was putting his life on the line. The king's own father had been poisoned by drinking wine that no one had tasted and checked. And so Nehemiah's job is to taste the wine, and if Nehemiah doesn't die, then it's okay for the king to drink it. If I'd been Nehemiah, I think I would have had some cats that I could have tested it on. Like, stick some of the wine in their milk, and if they live, well, I'd give it to the king. I don't know if I'd taste it myself. I'd use cats as the test dummies, you know. But Nehemiah was living for already something bigger than himself. And the next step of his involvement as a human being was to do something about the walls that are broken down Jerusalem. But what I know about Nehemiah is that he must have been raised in a family where he was taught and showed how to live not just for himself. We've got a generation of young people growing up today in a me culture, in a culture that's all about me. And if you're a parent, and if you have teenagers, if you have young children, it sometimes just takes guts. It takes determination. It takes a willingness to be misunderstood by your kids even, to teach them and show them and guide them how to put others ahead of yourself, how to live for something bigger than me. And Nehemiah had that background, which is why you could see this coming out in his life. His background set him up for his future. And if you're in a job, if you're in a position where you think, why am I here? Why am I positioned? Well, God had Nehemiah where he could do something about things that were important to God. And I'm sure that that's where God has you. There is no such thing as an unproductive place in God's kingdom. God can use you wherever you are right now in your circumstances. And that's what he did with Nehemiah. But the interesting thing of the story, and next week we will really go into the story, and this week is just an introduction to living bigger than me. And read the story yourself this week if you get a chance. It's a really brilliant read. It's a great story. But in this story of Nehemiah and restoring the walls of Jerusalem, he has a contemporary. His name's Ezra. Now, Ezra wrote the book of Ezra and Nehemiah wrote the book of Nehemiah. But they were contemporaries, and about 13 years before Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem to restore the walls, Ezra went back to restore the temple, to establish temple worship. And when he left on this 4 or 5 month journey to go back from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, the king of Persia gave him everything he needed, all the finances, all the equipment, everything he needed. And Ezra said this was God's provision. This secular king who wasn't a Christian, who gave Ezra everything, Ezra goes, that's the hand of God. 13 years later, same king, when Nehemiah asks for help, he helps Nehemiah, gives him everything he needed. In fact, he gave Nehemiah an armed escort to do the 4 or 5 months trip to Jerusalem. There were bushrangers. There was marauding hordes of evil Vikings. There were people that were going to kill them for what they had. They carried really precious stuff, taking them back to Jerusalem. And he accepted willingly what the king offered. But Ezra, 13 years earlier, he says this, I was too ashamed to ask the king for protection because I told the king, my God will protect me. Ezra said no to the vaccine. He said, I can't take it because in my conscience I believe God's going to protect me. Nehemiah, he said, I'll take it. I'll have the protection that you've got there. I'll take the vaccine. And what's important about the story is that God was okay with both. There were reasons Ezra didn't accept the protection offered. There are reasons Nehemiah did. Both God's people, both used by God. Ezra was a preacher. Ezra taught the word of God. Ezra relied on God for protection. Nehemiah relied on the world system for protection. And God looked after both of them. But here's the thing. They didn't get into a place where they tried to change the other one's views. They didn't try to change the decision the other person made. They left each person to make their right decision. And right now, in our world as Christians, we have choices. There are reasons not to get vaccinated. There are reasons to get vaccinated. But the important thing is not to let it be a distraction from what God has called you to do, to live bigger than yourself. Nehemiah is on the wall and he's rebuilding it. And there'll always be an enemy that wants to get you distracted from what God has called you to do. And the enemy says, come down, let's have a coffee. We want to talk about stuff. We want to chat to you about things that are going on. And these are what Nehemiah said. This is what he said. I'm carrying on a great project and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down and have a coffee with you? Nehemiah was not distracted about stuff that can so easily distract us because he was living for something bigger than himself. And if you want to know if you're distracted about things that aren't living bigger for yourself, then ask yourself, where does your conversation so quickly get to? Where do you spend your time and energy? What do you research? What do you read? What do you talk about? What do you post? What do you share with other people? Where's your energy going? That will tell you if you're distracted from living bigger than yourself, or whether you're on focus, whether you're on track, whether you're staying on the wall in the position God has for you. At the start of our little chat today, I mentioned to you about my mum's funeral, my dad's funeral. And I mentioned that at a funeral, you get a generational perspective. You get to see the generational influences and where living bigger than yourself goes. And I want to finish this morning with an article that was printed in the Age newspaper in Melbourne quite a number of years ago. It's about my grandfather. But before I read it, I just want to make this comment. To live bigger than yourself, first of all, you need something bigger than yourself to come into you and do something in you. See, in church life, we tell people to live for God, to live for others, but you don't often get to see what that looks like. You can see that at funerals because it's condensed. And I want to read you a condensed story about my grandfather. I want you to pick up the heart of someone who lived bigger than himself. I want you to see what that looks like. But I want you to understand that what he has done with his life was the overflow of what God had done internally in him. When Jesus said to love one another, he said, as I have loved you. That's the beginning point. It's the encounter with God. And whatever happens in your life is the overflow of that. So this is my grandfather's story, written by his nephew, his brother-in-law actually. And so I'll read it to you. This is written by Sid McGain. In my 70 years, I've met some remarkable men and women, but my mind always goes back to a man with all the qualities possessed of a true gentleman, yet he came from the ranks of poverty. He was Will Alexander, a minister of religion when I first met him. I suppose the best description of him was as gentle as a woman, but as manly as a man. What a brilliant description of a human being, hey? His home as a boy was on a small farm at Mount Evelyn, where he lived with his parents and two younger brothers. The farm could not sustain them all, so at the age of 12, follow this through. This is a world that is gone now, but follow through the ages and what happens in the story. At the age of 12, he left school to work on nearby properties. When things got really tough and work scarce, he packed his swag at the age of 14 to seek a job anywhere he could find one. This is in the 1920s. This is taking place, right, in Australia. A world that's gone, but a very, very harsh environment for a 14-year-old boy to step into. A shy boy, he often went hungry, but never would take from his own people who had so little. He sent them money whenever he could. The years toughened his frame, and he picked up many skills, including carpentry. Then when he was 19, he came home with enough money to build a cottage with the idea of selling it for a profit. The family belonged, I love the way Sid McGain says the family belonged. The family belonged to the Methodist Church, and he went along with them to hear the Reverend Kane preach. After the service, he asked the Reverend Kane how to go about becoming a minister. He asked many questions, and the older man explained the difficulties with his lack of education and pointed out the financial commitment to go through college. The young man impressed him deeply, and he could see the sincerity and determination and desire to achieve his aim. Ahead were so many obstacles. Chief among them was the drawback that he'd only had 4 years schooling, and even selling the cottage would not get him enough money to go through Queen's College. He told his parents, and although they doubted their son's chances, they gave him their blessing. Having made up his mind, he worked and saved, and with Reverend Kane's help, he studied long and hard. Failure was not in this young man's mind. Then came the day when he entered college. The years that followed saw him become an ordained minister of the Methodist Church. He met and married my sister Flora, and they were sent to Maldon, a mining town near Castlemaine. Now, this was in 1929. I was 14 when I went to live with them and saw at first hand what true Christianity was all about. They were the days of the Deep Depression. The swag men used to come to the manse and never were turned away hungry. Many times I saw Will and Flora go without to feed them. One day I found my sister crying because she had written to our mother and did not have enough money to buy a stamp. Will came in and she told him the food had run out and there was nothing until her stipend came in at the end of the week. So many people had needed their help. I remember Will kissed her, then put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Come on, lad, we'll go get some rabbits." Somehow they got by. Then there was the day when the fire bell tolled and the news spread through the town of a mine disaster. 2 men were working, one up top, and he had lowered his mate down to an offshoot. For some time there was no answer from the calls, and he knew there was no hope of survival. Will volunteered to go down and took a candle. When the candle went out, which means that there was no oxygen, the gases in there would have killed my grandfather, so that's why they took the candle down. It says, when the candle went out, they pulled him up again until a gas mask was fitted. And my grandfather went back down and retrieved the dead body of this miner. Will Alexander was always there when people needed him. It didn't matter what race or religion. It was his creed to live for his fellow man, to live bigger than himself. He was a practical man. He heard about a crusty old timer who hated parsons and priests. But he was so ill, so Will went along to talk to him. The old boy lived alone and ordered Will out. Will just smiled and left as far as the wood heap. He was a great axeman, and he proceeded to cut up a good supply of firewood. They became good mates. His actions spoke more clearly than words. To the needy, a tray of scones. To those who are hungry, a loaf of homemade bread. Bit hard to see at the moment. He used to ride an old push bike, and many is the time I've seen him hop off it and join in a game of cricket and footy. There was an old broken up tennis court that he organised a working bee and got asphalt laid so the young people could play tennis on it. The number of people he helped was legendary. Maybe he wasn't a brilliant orator, but the practical side of his life made up for that. I remember one of his patched white shirts under a cravat and collar, the shine of his pants, of his only one suit. Then came the day when they got enough to buy an old T-model Ford. He did all his own vehicle repairs on it when he was able to, and he was able to cut the travelling time to visit more people who needed him. Years after, when I was grown man playing league football for Fitzroy, Will was stationed there in Fitzroy, and often I would visit them to find on the veranda some old deadbeat, a tray in front of him with home-cooked meal. Odd bods came, and sometimes they were taken in by them. One couple I know wanted enough money to get to Mildura to go grape picking. They gave them their only £5, and these people promised to pay it back. They never did. But as my sister said, they could be telling the truth. We're here to help. When they passed away, they were in their late 60s. They left nothing of value, but to those who knew them, the memories of devotion to their fellow man live on forever. They could not see that I'd be standing here in a bird aviary in 2021, nearly 100 years after my grandfather began his ministry at Malden, and he lived his life for something bigger than himself. And the impact of that has changed my life. It gets passed generationally. If you want your kids, if you want your grandkids, if you want your life to matter and have influence beyond yourself, sow it into others. Sow it in a way that God uses it. Anyone can do nice things for other people, but when you do it in the power of God, in His name, with His backing and His function in it all, it changes you. It changes our world. And today's an introduction. We're going to have a look over the next few weeks what living bigger than me looks like. What living bigger than just our family, our career, the things we enjoy doing. What that looks like, the fruit of it, the benefits of it. It's just brilliant. It's the best way to live. It's the only way to live. I'll tell you why. It's the way God created us to live. And anything else doesn't come near. Doesn't come near. I want to pray for you. Lord, I thank you for everyone that's watching today online. I thank you for those that are in different states of Australia, for those that are here locally. I pray, Father, that you would give us a desire to see what others ignore, to be troubled and be bothered by what others can just walk past, that you'd help us to see what you see. You'd help us to be impacted enough to do something and to then experience the fruit and the benefits of that in our world, in our family, in our own life. Thanks. I'll hand it back to the team.